Hey, it's Mr. Norton, and we are wrapping up our lecture series on economic systems. And so up to this point, we focused on traditional, we focused on command, and we've also focused on market economic systems. And as we've been talking about all along, we don't actually have pure versions of these that exist anywhere as far as a national economy is concerned. They're going to be mixed economic systems. So what we're going to focus on is mixed economic systems in terms of this lesson. If you have a great understanding of how traditional and command and market works up to this point, then you'll be ready and set to go for this one. If you're not, I would strongly suggest you go back and look at those videos and review information that's needed to be familiar with the three types of economic systems that have been covered so far. Okay, so the first thing we want to focus on is talking about what a mixed economic system is. Basically, it's exactly what the name says. It's a combination of different economic systems, and you'll basically see anywhere you go a combination of all three. Now, that doesn't mean that they're equally balanced. Like, you're not going to have equal amount of traditional command and market be in place. And what's normally going to happen is you're going to see either a kind of a balance, depending on which nation you're going to, a balance between command and market, or you may see where it swings one side to the other between market and command. Remember, we had talked back in traditional how traditional isn't very popular because it's very outdated in terms of the style of basically the style of economy they have. It's based off tradition, and they usually have the lowest standard of living, so that's why we don't see much of it anymore. But there's a specific reference in your textbook that talks about a farm family inside of the United States and do an excellent job of explaining how it's an example of a mixed economy. Basically, you have a farm family, and now keep in mind, it's going to be a market economic system in terms of what they choose to grow. No one told them that they had to do that. Now, someone might go ahead and say that that's tradition too, because they were basically just growing continuously what probably generations before them had. But I'm going to go ahead and say that that's going to be an example of market because no one told them that they had to grow that. Okay, they are figuring that they can make a great profit off of that. That's what they can, they're specializing what they're going to do. So that's what they focus on. That would be an example of a producer using their scarce resources to make the most profit that they have. But there are some traditional aspects that they talk about within your textbook too, where it says that the roles of harvesting pretty much are predetermined, like certain family members will always do the same things. So that would be a form of traditional economic system with that particular family. But it also talks about grandparents who are too old to work on the farm, and so they receive Social Security. That's a government program, and so that would be command economic systems. And then they also talk about how the children go to public schools. Again, that's a service, a public good and service that's provided by the government. So again, that would be command. They talk about teenagers that are in high school also working part-time jobs inside the city. Well, they weren't given those jobs by the government. They were able to go out and get them on their own. So we're going to say that that's more of a market one. But at the same time, those teenagers are working minimum wage jobs, and minimum wage is something that's instituted by the government by law, and so therefore we have an aspect that's going to be considered command. So in this small little town in the Midwest, we have this example where we have a combination of all these different economic systems that demonstrate a mixed economic system. Things to consider, though, as we said before, just because you're a mixed economic system doesn't mean that you're equally mixed. So European nations, depending on where you go, Europe is funny because you have certain pockets of Europe where it's very market-based, and then you have some that are trying to keep it balanced, and you have some that try and go on the other end and be more command. So some examples of that would be like France. France has transitioned from going from where they were more command-based when they got out of World War II. That's the route that they took. But as time continued to go on, they found that the government wasn't really effective at managing certain portions of the economy. And so therefore, they ended up allowing those things to come out of government control and go more to the private market where regular everyday citizens could start businesses that deal with those particular aspects. We also have Sweden, which would be more of the command one. And I say that because the government owns about 1/3 of the businesses that exist. They also provide a lot of cradle to grave. That's what they say, cradle to grave. Like, you get these your entire life social benefits. You might hear politicians like Bernie Sanders talk about wanting to become more like Sweden. There's more to that than what he lets on. So it's not that easy. So like one of the things that aren't talked about is the fact when people pump up this idea of having an economy that's based off of Sweden, is that Sweden also has a 60% tax rate. Okay, so yeah, you get free you get free college, you get free K through 12, you get free like pre-K stuff, but at the same time, you're also giving up about 60% of your income in taxes too. Now that may have changed. I just using the stat that's in your textbook. I mean, the textbook was written 10 years ago. Those things might have changed a little bit. China, we look at China, they're more heavily on command because they're a communist style of government. And so the Chinese government really likes to, have a strong hand on top of what everything's done. But they also allow for privatization of certain things too. Like, for instance, Ford Motor Company works and has operations inside of China. They wouldn't do that if the Chinese government had control of it, because that would be China's Ford Motor Company. Well, not China's Ford Motor Company, but they would basically control the manufacturing process. When we look at the United States, it's more of market. I kind of gave some instances of that when we talk about that farm family in the Midwest. Keep in mind, like no one told me I had to become a teacher. That was something that I agreed to. No one said, at least for as much as I make, what my pay will be as far as a government. That was negotiated between myself and the school district. Of course, there wasn't much negotiation. They just kind of said, here's what we're willing to offer you. And of course, I could have said, no, that's not enough, and went somewhere else. I had the freedom to do that. So that kind of goes back to some of those principles of market economic systems that we had in our last video. But then, like all the things that I've bought today, I was able to decide what I wanted to purchase. So those would be instances of market. But at the same time, when I pay when I end up getting my paycheck, I have taxes taken out for things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and I don't pay it, but my employer does. But they pay unemployment insurance. So anyone who ends up collecting unemployment, that's where that money comes from, is your employer pays a tax on top of that. Those are all versions of command economic systems, because those are social welfare benefits. Okay, if you know anybody who receives housing assistance in terms of cash, if you know anyone who receives assistance with food through EBT, again, those are going to be aspects of command economic systems. If we go back to the market economic systems, if you didn't have money for food, if you didn't have money for housing, in a market economic system approach, it'd be like, well, that's just tough luck. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. Okay. We also have more, like there's an example in your book. I'm going to butcher this name, Namibia. I always thought it was Nambia. Maybe there's two different ones. My geography of Africa is pretty poor. Okay, but the example they use in your textbook is that they have a lot of people who do subsistence farming. If you don't know what that means, it's basically farming just enough to survive. You don't really make enough to go ahead and sell to other people, or if you do, it's very minimal. That government is trying to encourage a move towards a market economic system, and they're doing that to try and through the methods of trying to increase foreign investment. So if you have people who are in foreign countries, they see an opportunity to invest money and kind of create their own private businesses. That's how they're trying to move towards a market economy in those particular areas. Economies and change, when we're trying to do some changes, like we talked about with France trying to transition from one that was more command to one that's more market. There's a specific process for that. And then there's the process for going the opposite. If we're going to go from one that's more of market to one that's more of command, we have something that's called nationalization. And that's the reason for that is because the national government is the one that is taking ownership of those particular aspects of the economy. So like when we talk about countries like Venezuela is a country that used to be very heavy on market, and then with their current leadership in terms of their government came in, Maduro, he basically wanted to move them more towards command. So a lot of the things that used to be privately owned were then taken over by the national government. So they nationalized the oil production that used to be controlled by private businesses. And if you are interested in how that turned out, Venezuela is a very interesting case to study in terms of how they went from being I can't say that they were a very wealthy country, but they were one of the highest producing countries in terms of oil. And if you know anything about that, if you have lots of oil in your country, you typically have a very well-running economy. And one would say that they don't really have that so much anymore. And some of the things that have gone on is that more and more control over private businesses have occurred, and that's caused certain problems within Venezuela. And they have their own, well, civil strife going on within their country right now as far as which direction and which leadership they want to pursue. So if we're going to go the opposite way, if we're going to go from private ownership, if we're going to go from command, where the government owns anything that's everything that's nationalized, to one where it's private ownership, this one's easy to remember too. That's called privatization. And so what that means is that the government would release control of certain industries of the economy and then allow private business to go ahead and basically take on those roles. A lot of things that happen too in terms of trying to transition to market style is kind of like what we talked about with the African nation in the previous part, is we try and increase foreign investment. So when we talk about global economy, we're basically referring to all economic interactions that occur across international boundaries. You may hear someone say state boundaries when we're talking about international politics. I know that confuses students usually. That's because countries, as far as international politics, are usually referred to as states. Like when we talk about the Secretary of State for the national government, the state is referencing the entire country. Okay, so normally the way that you promote international trade is through trade agreements. There are certain ones that the United States have been involved in. Some, you know, depending on how much you keep up to date on politics. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was a trade agreement that was put in place, I believe, somewhere in the early 90s, and it was just recently replaced under the Trump administration by the USMCA. Now, what those agreements are those are basically, this is how we're going to do trade, and the countries that were involved in both of the agreements were the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Basically, they talk about here's the amount of goods that we're allowed to trade. I mean, it's really complicated, just kind of like the basic thing saying, like, this is how we're going to trade and what we're going to trade between countries. This is what's allowed. This is what's not allowed. So that's all you need to really know. Now, some of the reason that trade's easier to accomplish on the global level is because of changes in transportation. You know, over time, even in your lifetime, we've seen a lot of changes. So trade can be done electronically. Trade can be done through just in the last 100 years, you know, we can say that trade has been expanded to include air travel. It's always been included in terms of sea travel, but of course the amount that we can carry and the speed in which we can transport things certainly has improved. You go back to how things used to be traded maybe 150 years ago as far as transportation vessels. You look at a giant tanker vessel like cargo tanker that comes from China or goes from the United States to China. Those hold just tons and tons of cargo that can be used for trade. So that's going to wrap it up. That's going to be mixed economic systems, I should say, as well as talking about global economy. And so the next thing we're going to focus on in our series is we're going to end up transitioning into supply, demand, and pricing. And I'm looking forward to starting that with you. And we'll have to say goodbye until next time.